Long before Egypt and Babylon left their imprint on history, a remarkable culture crafted a vast treasure trove of gold and silver, yet to be fully discovered. Those objects that have been unearthed dazzle the eye and tantalize the senses. They were made by the Thracians, feared and ruthless warriors who challenged the might of the Greek and Roman empires. According to Homer, the Thracians fought mightily on the side of Troy during the Trojan Wars. Later, their fearless strength would be epitomized by the renegade slave Spartacus, who led the greatest slave rebellion in history. In spite of their warrior-like ways, it is the Thracians' exquisite treasure pieces that have left present-day people gasping in awe, inspiring them to go in search of the mystery gold of the Black Sea warriors. The Western world first learned of the treasure trove of the Thracians in the late 1980s with the tearing down of the Berlin Wall and the dismantling of the Soviet Union. In the Republic of Bulgaria, demonstrations in the streets of Sofia, its capital, in 1989 and 1990 called for the resignation of its hard-lined leadership. When the Iron Curtain fell, the world caught its breath, for hidden in Bulgaria was a treasure of unimaginable magnificence. A treasure crafted by the ancient people who once inhabited this vast and little-known land. The pieces are unique in their sheer beauty and craftsmanship. Many of them are in sparkling 24-karat gold or the purest silver. But what motivated the Thracians to depict effigies of gods, heroes, and animals? Who do these figures represent? And how were these simple people able to craft such ornate and sophisticated objects? For most remarkable of all, these pieces predate all other golden objects ever fashioned by human hand. Though news of the existence of the treasure had been known to the West decades ago, few realized how uniquely rich it was. Finally, with the opening up of Bulgaria, the entire world would witness the true extent of the collection, hidden behind the Iron Curtain for decades. Gold and silver urns, goblets, plates, religious artifacts, ceremonial objects, horse bridles, a priceless treasure trove unearthed from some of the more than 60,000 ancient burial mounds scattered throughout Bulgaria. Like the Egyptians, the Thracians buried their dead in tombs with their valuable possessions. Once Bulgaria was open to the West, thousands of ancient treasure pieces worth untold millions of dollars were smuggled out of the country. Most of them never to be seen again.
The mounds are excavated illegally by the people who don't care about the scientific excavations. They are destructing the mounds. They are destructing the Thracian culture. And most of the finds are exported illegally into the Western world. The artifacts found in illegal excavations are sold on the black market. This black market is all over the world, in Japan, in Western Europe, in America.
In recent years, the Bulgarian authorities have clamped down on the illicit trade, and the creme de la creme of the treasure pieces have remained in the country. With the end of the rigidly imposed Soviet system, a cultural bridge was thrown open to the West. And this cleared the way for an exhibition of the finest pieces in the United States. The exhibition was arranged by Anne van de Vanter Townsend, founder and president of the Trust for Museum Exhibitions. Between 1994 and 1998, she arranged the first American exhibition of the treasures of Thrace. In the traveling exhibition, Ancient Gold, the Wealth of the Thracians.
The thing that amazes me about these pieces is that they imply a very sophisticated social structure of 7,000 years ago. Nobody knows anything about these people. There are over 10,000 burial mounds that have not been explored or excavated or even discovered. There could very well be more gold. I mean, every time you turn around, there's more gold.
But who made these remarkable objects? And what happened to the people who fashioned them, some as far back as 5,000 BC? One of the most important clues comes from the great Greek poet, Homer, who described a people known throughout the region for their magnificent horses, their warlike ways, and especially for their beautiful gold and silver craftsmanship.
Their horses are the most royal ever seen, whiter than snow and swift as the sea wind. Their chariots are masterworks in gold and silver. The armor huge and golden, unlike the war gear of men, but of immortals. Homer, the Iliad, 8th century BC.
We now know that the burial mounds date back to a time when Egyptian civilization was flourishing along the banks of the Nile, and Babylon thrived in Mesopotamia some 7,000 years ago. It was then that a mysterious civilization existed along the banks of the Danube River and on the shores of the Black Sea. Then, as now, this magical place was called Varna. Today, it has become the favorite vacation ground for the citizens of the former Soviet Union. But thousands of years ago, the Black Sea was home to an ancient and mysterious people who were the first to work in gold. This gold-shrouded skeleton of a Varnic king dates back nearly 7,000 years. His headdress comprises 24-karat gold discs, and the rest of his regalia is studded with more gold. The gold is some of the oldest ever found, at least 3,500 years older than the artifacts found in the tomb of the Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun. It was astonishing, pushing the age of goldsmithing way beyond the boundaries of previously conceived history.
The gold from the Varna culture is some of the oldest in the world, and it predates by several centuries some of the earliest objects from ancient Egypt and those from ancient Mesopotamia, which essentially changes our view of things. We used to describe Mesopotamia as the cradle of civilization. Of course, that's a very Western orientation. Now I think it's fair to say that this southeastern part of the Balkans should really be called the cradle, at least of European civilization.
These priceless objects have given us a new perspective on the human past, but more were to come. Fragments of an ancient time dug from Bulgaria's rich and fertile soil. What makes the treasure so enigmatic is that we know almost nothing about the people who made it. They left no alphabet, no writing, only a strange hieroglyphic-like pictogram script that has still not been deciphered. Eventually, these remarkable people were to disappear. Why? No one knows. In about 2000 BC, they were replaced by a motley group of disparate tribes who inhabited Bulgaria until about the 4th century AD. History records them only as the Thracians. It was these people, the Thracians, who appear in the writings of Homer, playing a central role in his famous work, the Iliad. In fact, it is from the Greeks, Homer and Herodotus, that we gain our first impression of these people.
Thracians are among the silent peoples of antiquity. They're like the Carthaginians and the Macedonians and the Etruscans in that they left no written record of their own activities and their own culture. What we know about them, we know from two sources. One, archaeology, and we're very privileged to have these wonderful objects which have recently been excavated in Bulgaria. And we know about them from foreign sources, largely Greek sources in the early period, and at a later time, Roman sources. But there is nothing from their own hand. They may have never had a form of writing to describe their own language.
But they did have gold. Since the first pieces were discovered in 1924, hundreds of magnificent artifacts have been unearthed. The objects cover a huge arc of time, from 5000 BC to when the Thracians disappeared in 400 AD.
The Thracians have been on the margin of ancient cultures for a very long time, from certainly the second millennium BC throughout the whole of the classical period, both Greece and Rome, and affecting areas that extend from the area where they're located along the Black Sea, all the way into what is modern Turkey, all the way to Greece, and then eventually to Rome itself.
These remarkable pieces reveal something of the lives of the ancient Thracians, and skimpy though the details may be, we can glimpse moments in the extraordinary history of these long-gone people. Though they crafted objects of exceptional beauty, theirs was not a gentle culture, nor a peaceful one. According to the Greeks and the Romans, the Thracians were some of the most brutal and warlike people ever to walk the earth. It was 1924 when the first pieces of the mystery gold of the Black Sea warriors were discovered. A farmer near the village of Volkatran in northern Bulgaria was plowing a vineyard when he suddenly discovered something solid, something glinting and yellowish sticking out of the ground. It was not only metal, but made of the purest silver and gold. Piece after breathtaking piece was pulled from the soil that day, revealing a treasure trove unlike anything ever seen before.
At that time, nothing to compare with this treasure was found. But it was a very funny story at the beginning, because the villager who happened to find this treasure didn't believe that it was made of gold, and even he gave his pigs to eat from these precious vessels. And thanks to Bulgarian archaeologists, it was kept for the future, and for us, of course.
The amount of gold and silver objects hauled from the earth in 1924 weighed almost 28 pounds. The pieces date back to the early Bronze Age, some 3,500 years ago. They were made by the original inhabitants of Bulgaria, the Varnik people. But what these extraordinary utensils were used for remains a total mystery. The silent soil of Bulgaria's distant past was only just beginning to yield up its secret bounty. More was to come. These pieces were found near the city of Varna. Pure golden jewelry dating back to an even older period, more than 4,000 years BC. This makes them a staggering 6,000 to 7,000 years old. They were the earliest products of the ancient people who first inhabited this land, and are, without question, the oldest golden objects ever fashioned by human hand.
The most spectacular find was made in 1972 in Varna, where our colleague Ivan Ivanov found the famous Varna Chalcolithic cemetery, necropolis. And in the graves he excavated, a lot of gold artifacts. For instance, only in one grave, the gold artifacts weighed more than 1.5 kilogram. For that time, it is unbelievable. And most of the scholars all over the world agreed that with this culture started the very civilization of ancient Europe.
Thousands of these tiny pieces have since come to light. They may originally have been sewn onto clothing or worn as jewelry. Today, they are priceless. As in many ancient cultures, the bull was a symbol of fertility and usually represented the masculine element in society. These 24-karat gold pieces, barely a few inches across, may have been part of the regalia of a king or ruler. The Thracians may have learned their metalworking secrets from the earlier Varnic civilization. We may never find the answers to such elusive and tantalizing questions, but the land under their dominion was rich with precious metals.
The gold and silver, was one of the natural properties they had in the area of Thrace, in the district around Mount Pangaeus. It was very rich in gold and silver. And the Thracians controlled that area right around to about the 4th century when the Macedonians took it away from them.
Writing in the 5th century BC, the Greek historian Herodotus began to document Thracian life. He viewed them as a disunited and divided people who found it difficult to live in peace among one another.
He gives about 10 or 12 specific names of tribes. At one point, Herodotus says something like, if these tribes could be united, they'd be the most powerful nation on earth. But of course, that is impossible. It's impossible for them to unite.
The Thracian kingdom was not a single kingdom. It was not highly organized as a state, as we tend to think of it. This is a collection of tribes. From time to time, a single tribal leader would emerge and organize many, although not necessarily all of the Thracians. There was, for example, no capital. Where was the capital? It's wherever the king hung his hat at night, or perhaps his helmet. There was no organized government in the sense that we'd like to think of a state having an organized government, a rather loose federation or confederation of tribes who sometimes acted in concert for some common purpose, but often were at war with one another.
According to historians like Herodotus, Thracians thrived on warfare and confrontation. They often invaded one another's tribal territories, or more frequently, carried out lightning strikes on surrounding nations. Throughout the centuries, Thracians were often referred to as an extravagant, drunken, uninhibited people. Writing in his Republic in the 4th century BC, Plato says that high-spirited and ferocious behavior typified the ways of the Thracians. Livy, the Roman historian who existed at the same time as Christ, wrote,
Of all the victors after battle, the Thracians were the most conspicuous. They returned to their camps singing loudly, bearing the heads of their enemies impaled on spears.
Greeks regarded them as barbarians. To a Greek, a barbarian was somebody in the most neutral sense who did not speak Greek. So highly civilized people were barbarians. Persians were barbarians because their language sounded bar to a Greek. But there were the stories they told about Thracians were that they loved to fight, they were prodigious drinkers, and they threw wild parties, and that made them barbarians. We would call them college students.
Ruthlessness and brutality often characterized the Thracian way of life, not only in their dealings with those nations that surrounded their territory, but in the treatment of their own people.
One of the Thracian chieftains, I guess Herodotus calls him just a chief, was pressed to give his sons to participate in the Persian attempt to expand into Greece, the Persian War period. His father did not want any of his sons to go, but all went. As Herodotus tells the story, they were very fortunate indeed that they all came back alive and unharmed. Their father, the chieftain, gouged out their eyes because they disobeyed him by going with the Persian king.
Of all the confrontations that have bloodied the pages of history in the ancient world, few are as familiar to us as those that characterized the Trojan War. And even then, the Thracians would play a major role in the unfolding of those turbulent events. One of the oldest written references to the Thracians comes to us from the 8th century BC. It was then that Homer, the Shakespeare of his day, and perhaps the greatest of all Greek authors, wrote of the legends, myths, and history of the Greek people. His most famous work was the Iliad, an epic poem describing a battle waged by Greece against the people of Troy. It was a time of city-states and feuding kingdoms. According to Homer's account, the Thracians fought alongside the people of Troy in their bid to prevent invading Greeks from taking away the beautiful Helen and her husband's fabulous treasure after she had eloped to Troy with her lover Paris, the handsome young son of Priam, the king of Troy.
The Thracians fought alongside the Trojans against the Greeks. Many of them were killed, including their king. Many of their horses were slaughtered as well. They do keep up a separate existence on the battlefield at Troy, but they seem to be remote, even though they're a part of these forces. We have a few other references to the Thracians, often individual Thracians being killed, or to incidentals, the wine of Thrace, particularly beautiful vessels that are made out of gold or decorated with silver.
With Thracian help, Troy withstood the endless attacks by the Greeks. 9 long years passed. According to Homer, some of the gods on Mount Olympus took the side of the Greeks, others the side of the Trojans. But in the end, it would be a mortal war, fought by real people of flesh and blood. Soldiers, chariots, and siege towers were brought into the conflict.
In the second book of the Iliad, there is a catalog of forces, both on the Greek side and on the Trojan side. And the Thracians are there as allies of the Trojans and the Trojan king. About halfway through the Iliad, in Book 10, 2 of the Greek warriors go on a secret night scouting raid to see what they can learn and what damage they can do. When they find some unsuspecting fellow who provides them information, this fellow, who is hoping to get off with this information, says, "Here are the Thracians, separate beyond all others, in place, and among them Rhesus, their king." So there we do have a specific name.
The horse features prominently throughout Thracian history, especially during the Trojan War.
They were superb horsemen. The horse is a very important theme in Thracian art. It decorates many of the objects discovered in Thracian tombs. The bridles of horses were elaborately decorated with gold and silver.
Swift and powerful, the Thracians and their horses helped the Trojans to withstand the Greek onslaught. Then, one morning, the Trojans awoke to find the Greeks and their ships gone. The only thing that remained on the beach was a huge wooden horse. The Trojans unwittingly saw it as a peace offering from the Greeks, ending the long years of conflict. The rest of the story is familiar to us all, as the Trojans pulled the horse inside their city, where in the darkest hour of night, a handful of Greeks silently crept out of the horse and unlocked the gates of Troy. Within minutes, the invading Greek armies returned and swarmed in, laying waste the entire city and carrying Helen back to their ships. Thracians would participate in many future battles, often as mercenaries and soldiers of fortune, fighting on the side of whomever would pay for their services.
They could be described as guns for hire. The Thracians were incorporated into some Greek armies as mercenary allies if they had a weapons specialty that the Greeks lacked. Philip II, the father of Alexander Great, fought against them and incorporated a few of them into his army. And so, yes, they served a very valuable function as mercenaries.
We are told by the written sources that the Thracian king was able to create an army of 150,000 foot soldiers and 20,000 equestrian soldiers. So it's an enormous army for the ancient world. And the Thracians, famous with their qualities of fighters, were very precious fighters and very precious soldiers in the ancient world.
The Thracian warrior was interwoven with the story of Mediterranean and Middle Eastern events for centuries. They feature prominently in the story of great civilizations, from the Greeks to the Macedonians, Mycenaeans, Phoenicians, and Persians. But their most bitter and bloodiest brush with history was yet to come, when a single Thracian would rise up in defiance of the world's mightiest empire, Imperial Rome. It is the 1st century BC. Imperial Rome is at the pinnacle of her power. Her empire has grown to become one of the mightiest ever known. Rome dominates much of Europe, the Mediterranean, North Africa, and the Middle East. Prisoners and slaves are often brought back from distant corners of the empire or from surrounding areas and inducted into the Roman army. One of the areas they invade is Thrace.
In the 1st century BC in particular, when the Romans were making these punitive raids into Thrace, they undoubtedly produced a lot of slaves. Thracians fought as gladiators. One of the styles of gladiator fighting was the Thracian style. There was the Samnite style, which is heavy infantry, and these are the guys in those big funny metal hats that always show up with the grills on them. The Thracians were the light-armed ones. They were very lightly clothed. They had maybe some leather protection and a buckler, a small shield. And then they had this big sword, and that's the way they fought.
One of the finest gladiators was a man called Spartacus. The details of his life are sparse, but of one thing history is certain. He was a Thracian and was inducted into the Roman army. He had a reputation for being insubordinate and may well have hit a superior officer. He deserted, was recaptured, and sold into slavery. Spartacus ended up in a gladiator training school, where he became skilled at using the Thracian sword in hand-to-hand competition. In 73 BC, he escaped from the school, taking 70 other gladiators with him.
They made up a camp in Mount Vesuvius, which a little more than a century after this was going to blow up and destroy Pompeii. At this time, it was dormant and it was considered actually an extinct volcano. They were living inside it, and the Romans sent a force to capture them. They thought nothing of it. These were escaped slaves. There was only one route into the crater, and the very steep walls and foliage elsewhere, so the Romans simply camped at that route and decided to starve them out. But Spartacus and his allies used trees and fibers to make a rope ladder, climbed down the other side of the craters, surrounded this Roman force and destroyed it, which brought them a lot of weapons. And it also brought them a lot of other people who didn't want to be slaves. So they suddenly grew to prodigious numbers, thousands and thousands of people.
Spartacus and his renegade followers swelled to over 100,000, overrunning most of southern Italy. It was one of the greatest slave revolts of all time and cost the empire a fortune to put down. For 2 long years, the rebels eluded the Roman army. but they were eventually defeated by Marcus Crassus and 8 legions of Roman troops near Capua. Spartacus lost his life in the battle, but his body was never found. The survivors were crucified, nailed to crosses for a distance of 90 miles, all the way from Capua to the gates of Rome. A century later, in 46 AD, Thrace was incorporated as a province of Rome. Religious artifacts and decorative jewelry made in Thrace now began to reflect a Roman influence. This golden diadem, worn as a crown or headpiece by someone of noble birth, dates back to the 2nd century AD. It was discovered in southwest Bulgaria in 1992. This silver necklace is typical of Roman times, dating back to the 3rd or 4th century AD. While violence and bloodshed characterized much of Thracian history during the thousands of years that they lived on the Balkan Peninsula, their treasures reflect another side to their story.
When you cut through what the stories that the Greeks and Romans like to tell them, which involve drinking and fighting, there is an entirely different side to the Thracians that shows up in their jewelry, in this fine work, and even more so in their religion.
The Thracians were people who were sensitive to the outside world, and including to many different cultures that were contemporaneous with their own. We have, for example, a lovely gold fiale, a gold vessel, drinking vessel, a small dish that features concentric rows of heads which are very clearly Negroid, African in character. Now, is this to suggest that the Thracians held African slaves? Not at all. Africans were widely regarded in antiquity, in Greek and Balkan antiquity in general, as exotic people, not necessarily slaves, but so different as to, in a sense, be kept around and admired and shown off at dinner parties, and to be used in art. The Greeks made small ceramic vases in the shape of Negroid heads. The Thracians here are equally sensitive to the Mediterranean world's contact with Africa, replicated this with these concentric rows of Negroid heads in the base of this gold fiale.
In the absence of an alphabet of their own, during the Greek period, the Thracians incorporated Greek writing in their metalworking arts.
We know nothing about the Thracian language itself. None of it has survived. Whatever language they had apparently was never written. Now, there is some archaeological evidence, including some very beautiful objects, in which writing appears. The writing, however, is in Greek letters. It's writing their own language in Greek letters. There is a very beautiful ring which is chock full of Greek letters which make no sense if read as Greek. So this is an attempt by the Thracians to reproduce the sounds of their own language using Greek letters.
Perhaps the most intriguing and magnificent of all the pieces that make up the treasure of the Black Sea warriors are these ritualistic jugs or drinking vessels called rhytons.
One of the favorite vessels, the rhyton, has a history that goes back even deeper than the 2nd millennium. It belongs to the Bronze Age civilizations all around the Eastern Mediterranean, the Greek area. It is used for liquids and usually in a ritual kind of context.
These are, for the most part, burial vessels. Feature a peculiar kind of drinking cup, and they're often in the shape of animal heads. The Thracians had especially exquisite examples of this in their art. A stag head, for example, was a very common theme, exquisitely wrought of gold, and you would simply fill it up from the top, and then you would use it as a drinking cup. Some of them had rounded bottoms so that you could not set it down again until you had drained the cup. And they are unusual, I think, by Greek and Roman standards, although not unknown, but I don't believe there are people that wrought them with as exquisite skill as the Thracians did.
The treasure pieces of the Thracians speak to us not only of how these ancient people fought, lived, and touched the lives of those around them, they also tell us something of their religion and of their belief in immortality, in a life that transcends the grave. Modern-day Bulgaria reflects the welcoming warmth of a people whose lives have changed dramatically since the country was opened up to tourists from the West in the early 90s. Out in the countryside, a Thracian presence is still very tangible in the thousands of ancient burial mounds that stud the landscape. They served as graves for kings and chiefs, and it is in these sites where most of the gold and silver treasures were found. The finest pieces were buried with rulers and noblemen.
These treasures were buried for a very simple reason. They are part of grave goods. Whatever the nature of the Thracian religion and the Thracian beliefs in an afterlife, they apparently believed that they should take very valuable personal possessions with them, both as a sign that these were theirs alone and not to be passed on to another generation, and also, like the Macedonians, or to use an extreme example, the Egyptians, believed that these items would be useful to them in the afterworld.
While the most valuable of the treasure pieces were buried with those who could afford them, all Thracians, including the lowliest of warriors, shared one thing in common: a profound belief in life after death.
The Thracians were very, very brave warriors, maybe because they believed in the immortality. All of them were initiated into this doctrine or these mysteries, how to achieve immortality. The life doesn't stop with the death. The real life is in the world beyond, in the afterlife.
Even the tombs themselves reflect a strong belief in the afterlife, such as this one near Kazanluk, dating back to the 4th century BC.
The Thracian architects paid special attention to adornment, to the ornamentation of the doors, because the door was the entry to the other world. The door has its threshold, which was very, very sacred in the ancient cosmic system, because crossing this threshold, it means to go to the afterlife, to go to the eternity, to go to the immortality.
Many tombs, especially those dating back to Greek times, are highly decorated, depicting gods, heroes, humans, and animals. But a more sinister aspect of Thracian burial was the fact that many noblemen went to their graves not only with their precious gold and silver, but with their wives as well.
The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, and describing the habits of the Thracians, tells us that many Thracian men were polygamous. At the death of the husband, the wives who survived were locked in a competition with one another to determine who had been the favorite wife. The prize, or the winner of this contest, was that she would be killed and interred with her husband. It was a sign of great honor, and all of the losers, we're told by Herodotus, were struck with grief that they hadn't won the contest. In at least 2 Thracian tombs, we have female burials, along with the male burial. In one, the knife is still in the ribs. In the other, the spear point is still in the skeleton.
Though essentially militant, there was a more docile side to the Thracians. They excelled at music and song. Musicians and their attendants were painted on the dome of this tomb, built to house the body of a nobleman or tribal leader in about 300 BC. The tomb was discovered near the city of Kazanluk in 1944.
It's very funny that beside fightings, the Thracians were famous for their art of singing. The best singers in the ancient myth and the ancient mythology were Thracians. And in this way, we can say that the Thracian culture is always divided into 2 poles. One is the war, and the other one is the spiritual culture.
Though most widely remembered in Greek legends, Orpheus, the mythical father of music, is of Thracian origin.
The most unusual connections with the Greek world is with the figure of Orpheus, who was such a wonderful singer and musician that he could charm even lifeless things. He could charm the rocks, he could charm the stones, and so everything living, animals as well as humans. He is given a parentage of a muse, which is right, a Greek muse for his mother, and a Thracian prince for his father.
Greek and Thracian religion were closely intertwined. Thrace was the legendary birthplace of Ares, the god of war. To the Thracians, Ares was the most beloved of all the gods. Midas, the mystical king who could turn anything into gold, was also of Thracian origin. The Greeks were to eventually adopt them as their own, incorporating Thracian gods into their pantheon of deities. On the other hand, Thracians revered many Greek gods, including Dionysus, the god of wine, and Artemis, goddess of the earth. This solid gold rhyton, or ceremonial jug, was part of a cache of buried treasure discovered by workmen digging for clay in 1946. It depicts the god Dionysus and the goddess Areope, surrounded by dancing figures. Here, Heracles, the son of Zeus and the most popular of all Greek heroes, is seducing Og, daughter of a priestess. The scene is magnificently depicted on a silver and gilt plate from the 4th century BC. The ghosts and spirits of the Thracians haunt these hills today, but the Thracians themselves are long gone, swallowed up in the tides of history.
Eventually what happened, their area was a gateway for these invaders, Germanic peoples who started invading later in the 3rd century and the 4th century. It was a huge battle in Thrace that was one of the decisive battles at the Battle of Hadrianople, a city founded by the Emperor Hadrian, that destroyed the Eastern Roman army. And eventually, in the 6th century, the Emperor Justinian, who is frequently written in textbooks as the last Eastern emperor to assert authority in the West, but he did that by stripping the Balkans of Roman soldiers, and that in the aftermath proved to be decisive because the Avars and then the Slavs poured in, and they absorbed the local cultures. That's what happened. You know, the Thracians were just absorbed.
All that remains of the Thracians today are these treasures. The splendid gold and silver artifacts are the remainder of a priceless legacy, once sold on the black market, but now available for all to see and enjoy within the safety of museum walls.
The Thracian legacy, it seems to me, lies primarily in their fine art. That art took many symbols, many skills which were native to their part of the Balkans. They took some from the East. They melded them to form a rather high art in metalwork especially, and passed that legacy on to the South, to the Macedonians and to the Greeks, where it was further refined. And I think in that sense, what they taught us was an enormous skill in the appreciation of and in the working with metals, especially precious metals. So I would say that one of the great anomalies of the history of the ancient Thracians is that a people who in their own time were noted for their warlike abilities, in fact made their greatest contribution in art in precious metal.
The Thracian legacy is one that will endure for all time, for surely in all of human history, seldom did a culture produce a treasure as magnificent as this, the mystery gold of the Black Sea warriors.